I thought it would be a good idea to have a candle here to give me some cute little autumn vibes, but then I realized that this candle is actually a crackling wick and it's going to be ridiculously loud in all my clips, so we're cutting that. I'm getting rid of it. Please ignore my clip lighting the candle because that was a lie. Hey, my name is Emma, aka Midsummer Knits Dream, and today is the second episode of my knitting podcast. In today's video, I'm going to just be knitting, talking to you guys about a couple of updates that I've had since my last podcast episode, and just catching you guys up on my life since I last posted a podcast episode. It's going to be a little bit more of a casual and chatty video, and I hope you guys enjoy. Just to give an update on what I am wearing right now, I'm wearing the one that I want crop, which I thankfully fixed, so the buttons actually fell off. And in my little knit flips video, I showed myself fixing the buttons on this top, which I'm so happy about because, as I mentioned a million times, this is one of my favorite things that I've knit and just so much fun to wear. I'm also wearing these really cool shop kike earrings. I forget what they're called. I'll put the name up on the screen if I can find it. It's something about like video game lives, which I think is so cool. They're very dramatic, but I really love them. I think they're super cool. So I wanted to start off by giving a little update on, first of all, what I'm knitting and also all of my projects that I've finished or worked on since the last time I actually did a knitting podcast. So I've had a few videos in between this and the last knitting podcast, but they have been other videos that are not actually a podcast. And I feel like with my podcast videos, I would love for them to be sort of a continuous series in that you can just watch them all in order and see exactly what I'm making every single time. So I'm never sort of like leaving out projects even though I've done other videos on them. So for example, I already made a separate video about my granny square halter top, but I'm also going to just recap what happened in that video in this one and give you guys an update so that anyone who didn't watch that video is also going to know what I've made since my last podcast episode. So to start out, I will start by talking about what I'm knitting right now. I talked about this in the last couple of videos probably, but definitely my fall knitting plans video. And this is my second groovy tank. So a few months back, I finished my first groovy tank, which is a design that I'm working on. And that first one was in a dark purple color. I'll insert a picture of it on the screen here. And that is my first ever attempt at a garment design. With that being said, I decided to make a second one just to like iron out some of the details and to additionally show a slightly different option for people to see. So this one is going to be a bit more cropped than my first one, and it's also in a different color. So that's what I'm working on right now. The first bit of the groovy tank is just straight ribbing until you get to the bust section when you have sort of the design and the increases in the pattern. So for right now, I'm just doing 2x2 ribbing on very small needles, and it's been a very mindless project so far. Once I get to the bust increasing part, it's going to be a little bit more thought put into it, just in that I'm going to try to write up the pattern while I'm doing that bust increase section. So when I first knit the groovy tank, I feel like I knit it and I wrote down a couple of notes so that I could understand later on what I was doing, but I didn't do a good job of writing a fully fleshed out pattern. So now that I'm knitting it for the second time, I would like to get down a pattern and make sure that my instructions will actually make sense to a different person. And then after that point, I still have to work on grading and getting this out to testers. So for now, it is a pretty chill and mindless project, which I like, but pretty soon it's going to be a little bit more complicated. I also wanted to give an update on the last couple of projects that I've done, since I didn't necessarily talk about those in my last podcast episode. So the first one is actually the project I was working on in my last podcast episode, which is the 8 p.m. tank. I did give an update on this on Instagram, so if you already follow me on Instagram, you can feel free to skip ahead of this part, but I realized that I hadn't actually given an explanation for what happened to the 8 p.m. tank on YouTube, so here I am giving you guys the full story. So basically what happened with the 8 p.m. tank is, from my last podcast episode, I had been working on the 8 p.m. tank, and like I mentioned in that episode, I believe, I had redone the cups multiple times, just trying to get them perfectly correct. I'd done them a few times before that podcast episode, and they just weren't really fitting me properly. So in that podcast episode, I was trying to knit them, I think, a third time. So since that podcast, I basically got to the point where I was almost done with the 8 p.m. tank, so I actually knit both of the straps and tried it on and realized it still was not fitting properly, which can be frustrating, especially on a project where you've frogged and redone the project multiple times. I was definitely getting frustrated with it, and this was also a fit issue that was not necessarily easy to fix. So it wasn't something where I could just pull it out and do it again with more or fewer stitches and it would have fixed the problem. The problem was that the cups fit properly except for the sides. So the sides were strangely loose on me, which I think indicates maybe I picked up too many stitches on the sides, and so there were more stitches on the sides as opposed to the front. Either way, I'll include a picture of it on the screen so you can see sort of what was happening, but I feel like it looks worse in person than it looked in the picture. In the picture I feel like it was slightly camouflaged and didn't look that bad. But this fit issue was just kind of frustrating me, so I decided it would be good to just put this project aside for a bit. Like I said, this project has been one that I've been working on for quite a while and have redone a few times, and so it was getting to a point of definite frustration. And I was really conflicted between trying again for what I think is a fourth time, or just frogging the project completely since it had been giving me so many issues and just didn't really seem to fit my body properly. And I decided it would be best to just put the project aside, probably until next summer when this project will be a little bit more in season again. Obviously I'm working on another tank top right now, so that's not the full explanation, but I honestly just felt like I needed a break from it to get in a better mental headspace with it. And I think next year when I come back to the project, I can have sort of a clearer perspective on whether I should just frog the project completely and decide that it's not going to fit me, or give it another try. Honestly, I was leaning towards frogging the project completely at this point, but honestly after I was mostly complete with the project, I decided to take some pictures of it just to make a quick Instagram recap post and talk about what had happened. And I honestly was so blown away with how beautiful the design is still, even given the fact that it doesn't fit, that I decided maybe I would want to give this one more chance. So for now, I feel like that project is just in purgatory. I'm just not thinking about it, just taking a break from it and doing some other things. And when I come back next year, I think I will be able to have a more sort of objective perspective as to whether I should frog the project or give it another go. So that's pretty much it for that project. Since my last podcast episode, I have also made a granny square halter top, which is my first ever real crochet project. I'm gonna go ahead and direct you guys to the full video on my process of making that, it being my first big crochet project and also it being just like a sort of challenging project in general. I thought it was a really fun one to watch the process of, and I know that video is a bit on the longer side, so some people might not be interested in watching it, but if you are interested in watching me learn how to crochet and how to make this really cool granny square halter top, then I would love for you guys to check out that video. Otherwise, that project was also a little bit trickier than anticipated. It just took a little bit more work, especially when it came to the seaming and weaving in ends process. And it honestly came out very cool, but as I talked about in that video, there are also some small fit issues with it, so I honestly need to try to resolve those issues before I feel comfortable wearing it out in public completely. But I think it was a cool project to take on, and I'm glad that I tried out crocheting. Another thing about that project is it used up a lot of various stash yarn I had, which I'm really proud of myself for doing. Since the beginning of my stash no-buy, I have not been the best at making projects that actually use up a lot of stash. Honestly, I'm just not the fastest knitter, or at least I don't have enough time to be getting through lots and lots of projects and lots of yarn every single month. Unfortunately, I would love to be able to do that. But because of that, I feel like my no-buy has felt a little bit unsuccessful, just in that since the point when I decided to do the no-buy, pretty much the granny square tank top is the only project that I took on that I didn't have in progress at the start of the no-buy, and that actually used up a significant amount of stash. So if you watch my fall and winter knitting plans video, you'll know that I have a lot more ideas of things to make this year that actually will use up some of my stash. So I am excited to try and jump into some of those projects that are going to use up stash and see how successful we can be in this no-buy before the end of the year. I also wanted to talk a little bit about some of the media I've been consuming since my last podcast episode. So this idea is slightly stolen from Knits by Mandy, which you should definitely check out her videos. I absolutely love them, and especially her podcast episodes are just like very relaxing and fun to watch. But one of the sections that she includes in her podcast is media that she's consumed, whether it be books, podcasts, movies, etc. And I would love to do this especially with media that I've consumed while knitting. So as I talked about in my first podcast episode, I've been watching Supernatural for honestly this entire year up until this point. It's been a really good TV show to put on and just have sort of in the background while I'm knitting. And I'm actually getting towards the end of Supernatural at this point. I'm on season 13 and there are 15 seasons, which first of all is just absolutely insane. It was such a successful TV show and it literally only ended in 2020 after being on the air for so many years. So kudos to them, and honestly thank you to them for giving me so much good knitting content looking back on this entire year, almost everything I made while watching Supernatural, so that's pretty cool. But aside from Supernatural, which I feel like I already rambled about enough in the first podcast episode, I have wanted to start listening to audiobooks while knitting for quite a while. So I don't think I've ever talked about it much on social media or YouTube or anything, but I do really enjoy reading. For the most part, I like reading fiction. I think I read sort of a wide variety of different fictions. I'll read some like fantasy and science fiction, some romance, some just like contemporary fiction novels, and definitely a good bit of sort of like young adult novels. I recently reread Percy Jackson, which was such a fun little break from any sort of heavy reading, and I'm honestly going to try and read the spin-off series from Percy Jackson after that, which was just fun. I actually decided to read it because there is a new Percy Jackson TV show coming out, which I love to watch, and it's just fun to sort of like read something from your childhood again and look back on it with nostalgia. But aside from my little reading adventures, I have been wanting to listen to audiobooks specifically because that will be something that I can actually do while I'm knitting. So when it comes to reading, like I said, I really enjoy reading, and especially reading just like fun little novels, things that like aren't too heavy. But I have not been reading quite as much this year because I've been so busy with knitting. So I actually read, I think, over 30 books last year, which I was really happy with. I know other people read a lot more than that, and it's not like anything to be incredibly impressed by, but I was happy with it because honestly throughout all of high school and college, I sort of barely read at all. I would maybe read like 1 or 2 books a year, but that was basically it. And when it came to around the time of the pandemic and when I graduated from college, that was when I sort of started to pick up reading again. And I just wanted to have fun with it and enjoy it and not put too much pressure on myself to read a certain amount or read a certain quality of book. I think a lot of people sort of put that pressure on themselves to be reading like really informative books or really just like adult books. And like I said, I just reread Percy Jackson, so I'm definitely not putting that pressure on myself. But I was really happy with having read 30 books last year, and so I sort of set that as a goal for myself again this year. If you guys have Goodreads, you'll know that you can set a reading goal for the year, and I know it's just like a little informal thing to try and encourage yourself to read a little bit more and keep up with that habit. But for me, I decided to set a goal again this year of reading 30 books, and I have been a little bit behind on that. As much as I want to read, I also really want to knit, and it's just hard for me to prioritize both of those things. And so I thought it would be a really good combination of my 2 hobbies if I was able to listen to audiobooks while knitting. And so I recently listened to my first ever audiobook, which is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. It's basically an autobiography / memoir about Jeanette's life growing up in the eye of the media and how that affected her in addition to how her mom raised her. Her mom had cancer, but also sounded like she was a narcissist or just like a very toxic person. She basically raised Jeanette to have an eating disorder and to be very focused on the desires of the people around her. It was just a very heavy book in that Jeanette has gone through some really horrible things, but she also narrated it so beautifully and so simply, and I really enjoyed it. I think as a book I would have loved it, but as the audiobook, listening to her talk specifically about her life was just incredible. It was honestly the best first audiobook that I could have listened to, I think. And I definitely want to listen to more audiobooks after this experience. I definitely recommend I'm Glad My Mom Died. It was such a good book and such a good audiobook specifically. But if you guys have any recommendations for other audiobooks that I could listen to, please let me know. It doesn't have to be a sort of autobiography or memoir, but I would love similar recommendations or even just like completely different recommendations that you enjoyed. I think when it comes to audiobooks, yes, I am excited to listen to them, but in some ways it also brings a new set of challenges to be listening to a book as opposed to reading it. So like for example, I want to make sure that I'm listening to audiobooks where I like the narrator or the person reading the audiobook. I'm a little bit nervous that I could definitely come across certain books that I just don't enjoy as much as an audiobook. So let me know any opinions you guys have on audiobooks if you have any. I would love to hear them since I'm basically completely new to the world of audiobooks. And if you have just like any opinions on them, then please let me know. So I think that's pretty much it for this podcast episode. I know my updates for this podcast were a little bit smaller, just in that I've already shown these pieces that I'm making in other videos, so I didn't feel a need to completely go into detail about every single thing that I've made since my last video. But also let me know if you have any suggestions for just like the layout of this podcast. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I would really appreciate if you give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.